Have My Back, Yeah, Every Day. By Timeless Lords. Read by My Lost and Found. Summary. So that's why she found it odd when he suddenly shifted from being an adamant side and stomach sleeper to always sleeping on his back. This fic is 2,000 words and 1 chapter, and the link to the fiction is in the description below. So, on with the story. Annabeth spent a surprising amount of her life watching Percy Jackson sleep. Not in a weird way. It wasn't like she'd be sneaking into his cabin at night. At least, she hadn't been before they started dating a month ago. It was just that the life of a demigod was inherently transient, and they'd spent a lot of time questing with each other, and questing meant sleeping in shifts. And sure, one could agree that the purpose of shift sleeping was to watch out for threats, not watch your questing companions sleep. But in the absence of imposing threats, it wasn't like there was a lot else to do besides watch your friends sleep. And maybe Annabeth had focused on watching one friend in particular so much that she had picked up a lot of his sleeping habits. In the past month since they started dating, she'd only honed those observations into their minutiae. She could tell the twitch from his fingers whether the dream he was having was good or bad. She could tell from his breathing whether he was in a deep sleep or a shallow one. She knew he ran hot and only slept with a sheet, if anything at all. So that was why Annabeth found it odd that Percy had suddenly shifted from being an adamant side and stomach sleeper to always sleeping on his back. Adamantly, she'd probably spent more time in the past 2 weeks watching Percy sleep than she had every other time combined, so her sample size had grown, which could somewhat account for the shift from stomach to back, except that it wasn't an occasional switch, something she could have caught on to earlier. It was every single time. Every random nap, which he took a lot of these days. Every time she snuck into his cabin at night and fell asleep before her. Every time she fell asleep first and woke up beside him. Even right now, both of them on his bunk together, his head in her lap, despite the fact that there was a perfectly good pillow not 2 feet away. On his back. Always. Annabeth wasn't really supposed to be there at all, but Percy spent a lot of time asleep lately, and she didn't mind bending the rules to spend more time with him. Summer was starting to wind down, and that meant her time with him was starting to dwindle as well. She wanted to spend every possible minute they could together, even if it meant all she was doing was watching him sleep. And, okay, maybe they'd spent some time making out before Percy's nap. But still, he wasn't asleep yet, but he was getting close to it. He looked so peaceful and relaxed. Annabeth almost just kept her mouth shut altogether. But they'd both be going home in a few days, and she knew this was going to drive her crazy until she sucked it up and asked him about it. "You never used to sleep on your back," Annabeth said, finally unable to take it anymore. Percy's eyes fluttered open sleepily. Annabeth immediately felt a little guilty for depriving him of his nap, but he didn't seem upset, just confused. "Huh?" he yawned. "You always used to sleep on your side, or your stomach, and now you never do," Annabeth said. She watched as recognition flitted across his features, but he still hesitated before answering. "Oh, yeah," he said, unhelpfully. But Annabeth could tell that her instincts were right, and this was something going on. Not just her being a crazy person who spent way too much time memorizing her boyfriend's sleeping habits. Maybe she should have left it alone. He clearly didn't seem all that excited to talk about it. But she'd already brought it up, and it was clearly bothering him, and well, Annabeth was curious. "Why?" she asked. This time, he glanced away, his eyes finding the ceiling instead of meeting her gaze. "I guess after everything, it just sort of felt exposed," he said, slowly. It took Annabeth a second to realize what he meant by everything. There was the obvious answer, The one that went along with exposed. The one that, frankly, she was already kicking herself for not guessing from the start. His Achilles spot was on his back. So no fucking wonder he didn't want to sleep back to the world anymore. Annabeth could tell by the tone of his voice that it was more than that. Just slightly. But she couldn't even begin to parse out what that meant without acknowledging the obvious. "Oh, gods, I'm dumb," she groaned, covering her face with one hand. He laughed, his shoulders shaking against her legs slightly. "You're not dumb," he said. His voice was affectionate, but she could tell his nerves about the whole thing hadn't completely melted away. His finger had started tapping against the bedspread beside him, a nervous, unconscious gesture. "Yeah, but I should have..." Annabeth trailed off. She should have known. It was obvious. She was the only one who could have possibly known, because she was the only one who knew where his spot was, the only one he'd ever trusted with that information, and she hadn't realized. "What? Known?" Percy finished for her, raising an eyebrow. "Well, shouldn't I have?" Annabeth asked, peering down at him through her fingers. Percy reached up, tugging on the hand that was still covering her face, pulling it away, down above his head, wrapping it in his own. "Annabeth, I didn't even know that you'd noticed I'd switched. It's not a big deal." It had been so easy to forget about it all, the past month. Things had been normal, happy, better than normal, because now they were dating, and the war was over, and nobody was on the urge of predetermined death. And Annabeth had spent a month wondering why he'd stopped sleeping on his stomach, and it hadn't, not once, occurred to her why, even with the answer staring at her right in the face. She just hadn't wanted to look. If she was honest, the curse scared her. Sure, it provided protection in a more general sense. He was never going to get a cut or scrape or burn from the lava wall. But it made everything so tenuous. All of him was tethered to life through one tiny spot on his back. It could all fall away so easily, and Annabeth had been pushing that thought out of her mind for the entire past month. "Hey, are you okay?" Annabeth glanced back at Percy, jolted back to reality by his voice. He was frowning, little worried lines etched between his brows. "The curse isn't the only reason," Annabeth said, ignoring his question. "I mean, it is, but there's more." He grimaced a little, but didn't drop his eyes this time. "Don't worry about it," he said, trying to cover up his frown with a smile, squeezing her hand. But then his eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly, to her shoulder. Her shoulder, where under the fabric of her t-shirt, there was still a white scar from a poisoned knife that wasn't meant for her at all, and Annabeth suddenly understood everything. Percy could say what he wanted about the strategic placement of his Achilles heel, that it was small and hard to hit with armor on, and all those other things. But Annabeth knew why he'd put it on his back, maybe even better than he did. It was the same reason he'd always slept on his stomach, at least until now. Because even after everything he'd been through, all the fights he'd survived, and all the betrayals he'd suffered, he was still a little too damn trusting. He'd put his weak spot on his back because there was some part of him, however small, that still believed people were good and decent and would face you head-on the same way he would. That they wouldn't attack when you had your back turned, because even if it would give him an advantage, Percy would never win a fight that way. He'd banked on his own instinct, because that goodness was so built into his worldview, he probably hadn't even realized he'd done it. Obviously, that hadn't quite worked out, and Annabeth had almost died taking the knife that was literally and figuratively meant to stab him in the back. And Annabeth knew that was what he meant by everything, not just the curse itself. Percy was still looking at her, patiently waiting for her to be finished thinking, completely oblivious to her realizations. Annabeth bit her lip. She couldn't tell him all that. For one, it was the opposite of not worrying. And for another, she didn't want him to worry about her. And she didn't want him to be scared anymore. She wanted him to bear his back to the world as freely as he had before, because the thought of losing that part of him was painful in a way she didn't even know how to describe. "Get up," she said, nudging his head with her knee. "Why? Ow!" Another nudge, and Percy was sitting up next to her, rubbing his temple. As soon as he was up, Annabeth laid down, pressing her back to the wall of the cabin. "What are you doing?" Percy asked, his expression a mixture of confusion and amusement. "Fixing it," Annabeth said, patting the bed next to her. "Lie down." Percy gave her a weird look before following her instructions, tentatively lowering himself onto the mattress next to her, back down. "On your side, dummy," Annabeth said, poking him in the ribs for emphasis. Percy frowned, suddenly realizing what she was trying to do. "But you're—" Annabeth didn't even need him to finish his sentence to know that he was protesting the fact that her back would be uncovered this way. Never mind the facts that, A, the chances of them being attacked at camp in his cabin were slim to none, and B, Annabeth was not the one with her lifeline attached to one very specific, very exposed spot on her body. "Wall," Annabeth reminded him, kicking the cabin wall behind her with one foot, just to remind him that it was there. Percy sighed, but was either out of protests or too tired to use them. He rolled over tentatively, his back pressed against her front. Annabeth curled up into him, wrapping her arm around his chest, tucking her chin into the crook of his neck. She could feel him relax under her, something tense in his limbs melting away, his breathing slowing and evening out. "Better?" she asked, quietly, suddenly a little self-conscious. "Better," he agreed, finding her hand and squeezing it again. "Thank you." Annabeth smiled into his neck, lacing her fingers most securely through his. "You're welcome," she said, snuggling a little closer to him. They spent a quiet few minutes like that, before either of them spoke again. Annabeth would almost think Percy had fallen asleep, except that he was rubbing little circles into her palm with his thumb. "I could get used to this," he admitted. Annabeth's chest felt warm, and she didn't think it was from Percy's body heat. He was trying to sound casual, but Annabeth could tell he meant it. "Yeah?" she asked, softly. She could hear the smile in his reply, even if she couldn't see it. "Yeah, if you don't mind." It was Annabeth's turn to smile then. "I'm always gonna have your back, Seaweed Brain. You're just gonna have to get used to it." And that's for this fic. It was nice to do another Percy Jackson one. Like, of the ones I've done, I'm pretty sure I haven't actually done with one with like Percy and Annabeth as like the focus. And let me just tell you, out of like all of the ships out there and like canon, fanon, whatever, of existence of all time, forever, in anything, Percabeth, I don't know how to pronounce it. I don't know how to pronounce anything. But Percy and Annabeth are like one of my favorites of all time. Like, for most things, for most relationships and whatever, I am like, sure, you know, whatever, I'm fine with shipping characters with different characters. But like, with Percy and Annabeth, it like physically hurts me if they're not together. Like, I can't. They're too perfect. They're amazing. And this is just lovely and beautiful. And I love this fic. And I love, like, thank you for the author for like the blanket permission for their works. Like, I love blanket permission because it can be like, ho ho ho, I'm coming in here, I'm podficking a thing, surprise, here you go. Because it's great. Blanket permissions are great. A little surprise in your inbox for the author. But yeah, this fic is just so lovely. Like, I love that little detail. Like, Percy definitely feels like a stomach sleeper. And just, like, that little detail of, oh yes, his Achilles spot is just on his back, so he switches, and Annabeth notices, but she doesn't realize why. I love this. I so wish Rick did, like, more thought and, like, time spent into the, like, aftermath of Percy getting his Achilles curse, because it kind of just, like, at the end of, like, the 5th book of the original series, it was like, wow, this is a big thing, that it's like a sacrifice he made that to win the war, and this is gonna stick with him. And then in the 1st book in the next series, it was just like, woo, the river just washes it away, woo. And, like, I do like that they got rid of it, because it, like, increases the fan fiction potential just for, like, post the original 5 book stuff. Like, even, like, not even considering, like, Heroes of Olympus at all. Just, I like that it's just gotten rid of, but, you know, maybe could have been a little more, like, details like this fic. It's just, yes, it's great. Yeah, I love this. So I hope you guys did too. And I will see you guys next time. Bye!